In August 1923, a factory worker in Berlin finished his morning shift, collected his wages in a wheelbarrow, and ran to the nearest bakery before the price changed again. By the time he arrived, the bread cost more than everything the wheelbarrow contained. He left the money on the street. It was not worth the effort of carrying it home. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented Tuesday morning in the capital of one of the most industrialized, militarily powerful, financially sophisticated nations on earth. A country with universities, factories, banks, and a century of accumulated middle-class wealth. And in the summer of 1923, that wealth was disappearing so fast that people were burning stacks of banknotes in their fireplaces because the paper generated more heat than the coal it could no longer purchase. A loaf of bread in January 1923 cost 250 marks. By November of the same year, it cost 200 billion marks. Not because bread changed, not because there was a shortage, because the government had destroyed the meaning of the number printed on the paper in your hand. Ordinary Germans had done everything right. They had saved. They had worked. They had trusted the system completely. A schoolteacher who had spent 30 years building a pension found it was worth less than a single egg. A retired soldier who had invested his entire life savings found he could not afford a tram ticket. Everything they had built vanished in months. And the most unforgivable part of this story is not the scale of the destruction. It is that the men who caused it were never sitting in the dark, confused about what was happening. They knew exactly what they were doing. They made the choice deliberately, and they had reasons. The German government did not stumble into hyperinflation. It ran toward it. After losing World War I, Germany was handed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The reparations bill was 132 billion gold marks, a number so large that serious economists at the time described it as mathematically impossible to pay without destroying the German economy entirely. John Maynard Keynes, the most respected economist in Britain, resigned from the peace conference in protest and published a book warning that the terms would create catastrophe. Nobody in Paris listened. By 1921, Germany was already behind on payments. By 1923, France and Belgium had occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to extract reparations by force. The German government responded by ordering workers to strike and paying them to do nothing. To fund that policy, it did the only thing it had left. It printed money, not cautiously, not reluctantly, in volumes that destroyed the mathematical relationship between currency and reality within months. But here is the detail that changes everything. While ordinary Germans were burning their savings trying to heat their homes, the German government's own debt was evaporating in real terms at exactly the same speed. Every billion marks they owed became worthless at the same rate as every billion marks in a German citizen's savings account. The hyperinflation that destroyed the population was simultaneously erasing the government's obligations to foreign creditors. The citizens paid the debt. They just never knew they were doing it. While the average German was calculating whether his morning wages would cover lunch, a small group of people was getting extraordinarily wealthy, not despite the hyperinflation, because of it, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Hugo Stinnes was a German industrialist who in 1923 became the single most powerful private citizen in the country. His strategy was surgical. He borrowed enormous sums of money in marks, used that money to buy real assets, factories, mines, newspapers, shipping companies, and then repaid his loans months later in marks that had become essentially worthless. He acquired an industrial empire that would take a normal businessman several lifetimes to build. He did it in 18 months using money that cost him almost nothing to borrow and even less to repay. By 1923, Stinnes controlled over 1,500 companies across Germany. He was called the Inflation King. He did not hide what he was doing. He simply understood something the average German worker did not. In a hyperinflationary environment, debt becomes free money, and real assets become the only store of value that survives. Foreign buyers understood this too. American and British investors arrived in Germany in 1923 with dollars and pounds that bought German industrial infrastructure at prices that would have been considered criminal theft in any stable economy. Entire factories changed hands for the equivalent of a few hundred American dollars. German engineering built over decades transferred to foreign ownership in transactions that lasted an afternoon. The people who lost everything had one thing in common. They trusted paper. The people who kept everything had one thing in common. They owned something real before the paper died. Economists measure hyperinflation in percentages and price indices. What those numbers do not capture is what happens to a human being when everything they believed about the world turns out to be wrong simultaneously. The German middle class of 1923 did not just lose money. They lost the conceptual framework that had organized their entire lives. Work hard, save consistently, trust institutions, build security over time. Every principle they had inherited from their parents and passed to their children was invalidated in a single year. The savings account that was supposed to represent 30 years of discipline was now worth less than the paper it was printed on. What replaced those principles was something far more dangerous than poverty. It was rage without a coherent target. Ordinary people knew they had been destroyed by a system, but could not fully articulate how or by whom. That confusion made them extraordinarily receptive to anyone who offered a simple explanation with a clear villain attached to it. Political extremism in Germany did not emerge from nowhere in the 1930s. It was grown in the psychological wreckage of 1923. Historians have documented directly how the hyperinflation wiped out precisely the social class, the stable, educated, savings-oriented middle class, that in any healthy society forms the buffer against radical politics. Once that buffer was gone, the ground was completely prepared. A young Austrian political agitator named Adolf Hitler attempted his first seizure of power in November 1923. The same month, bread cost 200 billion marks. That timing was not a coincidence. The printing press did not just destroy the currency. It destroyed the society that the currency had held together. And the men who ran the press knew that consequence was coming too. Germany. 1923 is not a history lesson. It is a template, and it has been used repeatedly by governments that understood exactly what Weimar demonstrated, that when a state needs to erase an impossible debt without admitting what it is doing, the printing press is the cleanest available instrument. The cost lands on citizens who do not understand the mechanism until it is too late to protect themselves. Venezuela did it. By 2018, inflation reached 1,000,000% annually. Ordinary Venezuelans who had saved their entire lives watched their accounts become meaningless in months. Zimbabwe did it. Argentina has done it 3 times in 40 years and is doing it again right now. Turkey lost 80% of the lira's value in 4 years, while its government described the situation as temporary and manageable. The language is always the same. Temporary, manageable, under control. It is never under control, because the mechanism requires escalation. Once a government begins financing itself through currency debasement, it cannot stop without facing the political consequences it was printing money to avoid in the first place. The only question that actually matters is not whether this happens. History has answered that permanently. The question is what you personally hold when the paper in your country starts moving in that direction. Real assets, commodities, anything that exists independent of a government's promise. The people who survived 1923 intact were not smarter. They were just holding something real before the paper died. If you watch this far, you now understand the oldest and most effective weapon governments use against their own people. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments, which country today do you think is closest to 1923 Germany? The most interesting answer gets a full breakdown in the next video.